Good evening. Settle in and get comfortable and let your shoulders come down away from your ears. Tonight, we are going to walk through the whole story of a company called Enron. It was an American energy company, and for a while, it was one of the most admired businesses in the world. And then, over the course of a few weeks in the autumn of 2001, it stopped existing. That is the whole story, and I have just told you the ending, which is deliberate because tonight there is nothing to stay awake for. There will be no surprises and no twists and nothing that requires you to keep track of anything. I am simply going to walk through it in order, slowly, from the beginning, and explain the parts that are usually rushed past. And if you fall asleep somewhere in the middle, that is exactly what this is for. If these help you, you might like to follow the channel, and I will leave it there and say nothing else about it, because that is not what tonight is about. So, let us begin somewhere quiet. In the middle of the 1980s in the state of Texas, there were two companies that moved natural gas through pipes. One was called Houston Natural Gas. The other was called Internorth, and it was based in Omaha, Nebraska. Neither of them was glamorous, and neither of them was in the news, because a pipeline company is one of the least dramatic things a business can be. Gas comes out of the ground in one place. People want to burn it somewhere else. Somebody has to own the pipe in between and maintain it and be paid for the use of it. That is the entire business. And it is a good business in a steady, unexciting way, in the way that owning a bridge is a good business. In 1985, those two companies merged, and the man who ended up running the combined company was named Kenneth Lay. He had a doctorate in economics, and he had worked in Washington, and he believed strongly in something that was just beginning to happen in the American energy industry: deregulation. Now, this is the first thing worth understanding slowly because everything that follows grows out of it. For most of the 20th century, the price of natural gas in America was set by the government, not negotiated. Set. There were rules that determined what could be charged, and how, and to whom, and the companies operated inside those rules, and the rules changed slowly, and everyone knew where they stood. And through the 1980s, those rules were loosened. Gas prices were allowed to float and to be negotiated and to move up and down with supply and demand. And that changes the nature of the business completely. Because when the price is fixed, a pipeline company is a landlord. And when the price moves, a pipeline company is suddenly sitting in the middle of a market. And a market is a place where things can be bought and sold and bet on. The new company was named Enron, and it was headquartered in Houston. And it began as a pipeline business in a world that had just stopped being simple. Let us stay here for a moment because the next idea is the one that made everything possible. In the early 1990s, a consultant named Jeffrey Skilling was working with Enron, and he arrived with a proposal. It was, at the time, genuinely clever. And I want to be fair to it because it is easy to look back at this story and imagine that everything was rotten from the beginning, and it was not. His idea was this: the people who produce gas have a problem, which is that they do not know what it will sell for next year. The people who buy gas have the same problem in reverse. A factory that burns gas needs to plan and cannot plan if the price might double. So Enron would stand in the middle. It would sign long contracts with producers promising to buy at a fixed price, and it would sign long contracts with buyers promising to sell at a fixed price, and it would keep the difference. It called this the gas bank, which is a nice name for it because that is what a bank does. It takes on the uncertainty that other people do not want and charges for the service. And it worked. Enron became very good at this, and then it started doing the same thing with electricity and then with other things entirely. And by the end of the 90s, it was trading contracts in things like coal and paper and steel and even the weather. And somewhere in that expansion, quietly, the company changed what it was. It had begun as a company that owned pipes. It became a company that traded contracts, and the pipes became almost an afterthought. Now, here is the piece that everyone rushes, and tonight we are not going to rush it. It is an accounting method called mark-to-market, and I want to explain it properly because it is not complicated, it is just unfamiliar, And once you see it, the whole story makes sense. Imagine you are a normal company, and you sign a contract to deliver something over 10 years. Under ordinary accounting, you record the money as it arrives. A little bit this year, a little bit next year, and so on for 10 years. Your books show what actually happened. Mark-to-market accounting says something different. It says that if you have signed a contract with a knowable value, you may record the entire expected profit of that contract now in this year's accounts on the day you sign it. And there is a real argument for this, which is why it exists and why regulators allowed it. For things that are traded on open markets, it is often more honest. If you hold something whose price everyone can see, then pretending it is worth what you paid for it years ago is its own kind of fiction. Enron applied to use this method, and the Securities and Exchange Commission approved it in the early 1990s, and Enron became one of the first non-financial companies in America to use it. Now let us sit with what that means, gently, because this is the hinge on which the whole thing turns. If you can book 10 years of expected profit on the day you sign, then your reported profit this year depends on how many contracts you signed this year, not on how much money came in, on how many deals were done. And the value of a 20-year contract for something that does not exist yet, in a market that may not exist yet, is not a fact. It is an estimate. Somebody sits down and makes assumptions about what prices will do for the next 2 decades, and those assumptions produce a number, and that number goes into the accounts as profit. And if the assumptions are optimistic, the profit is large. And if next year you need the profit to be larger still, then this year's assumptions need to have been more optimistic than last year's. I want to be careful here because for a long time, nobody involved would have described this as lying. An estimate is not a lie. A hopeful estimate is not a lie either. It is simply that the company had built a machine in which the reward for hope was immediate and the cost of hope arrived years later, in somebody else's quarter. Let us pause there and breathe for a moment. By the late 90s, Enron was enormous. In the year 2000, it reported revenues of around $100 billion, which made it, on paper, one of the largest companies in the United States. Fortune magazine named it America's most innovative company 6 years in a row. Its headquarters in Houston was a tall glass tower, and there was a second tower being built beside it, connected by a curved sky bridge, and the trading floor inside had rows and rows of screens. And it was the kind of place that television crews liked to film. The company motto, painted in the lobby, was, "Ask Why." Enron launched an internet trading platform in 1999, which was genuinely ahead of its time, and through which enormous volumes of contracts moved. And it announced that it would do the same thing to broadband internet capacity that it had done to gas, and the share price rose on the announcement alone. At its highest, in the middle of the year 2000, a share of Enron cost around $90. There is one more piece of the story from that same period, and I mention it gently because it is the part that touched people who had never heard of the company. In 2001, the state of California went through an electricity crisis. There were rolling blackouts, prices rose to levels nobody had seen. People sat in the dark in their houses, and businesses closed for hours at a time, and the state government came close to financial ruin buying power. Enron was one of a number of companies trading in that market. Some years later, recordings and internal documents emerged in which traders discussed strategies they had given nicknames to. There was one called Death Star, and one called Get Shorty, and one called Fat Boy. Broadly, and without going into the mechanics, these were ways of taking advantage of the design of the market rules. Scheduling power to flow along routes that were not needed in order to be paid for relieving congestion that had been created on purpose. Moving power out of the state and selling it back in. None of it made a single additional kilowatt of electricity exist. And the reason I mention this is not to add another accusation, because there is no shortage of those in this story. It is because it shows the same shape as everything else we have talked about tonight. A set of rules was written. The rules had gaps, as all rules do, and a group of very capable people were paid to find those gaps. And they found them, and finding them was, in the narrow sense, their job. Whether that was legal was argued over for years afterwards, and settlements ran into billions. But the ordinary person sitting in a dark house in California in the summer of 2001 had no way of knowing any of it and would not have understood the mechanism if it had been explained. They only knew that the lights had gone off. Now we come to the second thing that needs explaining slowly, and then the rest of the story is mostly people reacting to things. It is called a special purpose entity. And again, the idea itself is ordinary and legal and used by many companies to this day. A special purpose entity is a separate company set up for one narrow reason, which is legally distinct from the parent. If a company wants to build a power station, it might create a separate entity to own that station and borrow money against it, so that if the station fails, the failure is contained. That is a normal and reasonable thing to do. There is one important rule about them, and it is the rule everything hangs on. For that separate entity to be genuinely separate and to be kept off the parent company's balance sheet, somebody who is not the parent company has to genuinely own a meaningful piece of it and genuinely be at risk. At the time, the threshold was 3%. An outside investor had to put in at least 3% of the capital, and it had to be truly at risk, because the whole point is that if it all goes wrong, somebody outside loses money. That is what makes it a separate thing and not just a pocket. Enron created a great many of these entities. Its chief financial officer, Andrew Fastow, designed them and gave them names, and some of the names have become quite famous. There was one called Chuco. There were partnerships called LJM1 and LJM2, named after the initials of his wife and children. And there was a set of entities called the Raptors. And what they were used for broadly was this. Enron would move things it did not want on its own accounts into these entities. Debts, investments that had fallen in value, assets that were not performing, and the entity would take them on, and the parent company's accounts would look clean. But the entities had to be funded, and the outside money was thin, and so, over time, they came to be backed by Enron itself, often by Enron's own shares. And that is the flaw at the center of the whole structure, and it is worth saying slowly because it is the sentence the entire story rests on. The safety net was made of the same thing it was protecting. As long as the share price rose, the arrangement held, because the shares backing the entities were worth more than the obligations inside them. But if the share price fell, the value of the safety net fell at exactly the same moment that it was needed. The people involved knew this, it was written down, and it was structured, and the structures were reviewed. Later investigation found that Chuco had never met the 3% test at all, because the supposedly outside money was, in the end, guaranteed by Enron, which meant that the entities had never truly been separate, and everything that had been kept off the balance sheet should have been on it. Let us rest there for a moment, and then we will walk through the last year, which happens quite quickly and quite quietly. In February of 2001, a journalist named Bethany McLean published an article in Fortune magazine. It was not an expose. It did not accuse anyone of anything. It simply asked how Enron actually made its money, and observed that the accounts were, in her word, largely impenetrable. It was a modest article, and the share price at the time was around $75. And life carried on. In February of that same year, Jeffrey Skilling became chief executive. He had wanted the job for a long time, and he had it for 6 months. On the 14th of August, 2001, he resigned. He gave personal reasons, and he was the 6th senior executive to leave the company in a year. And Kenneth Lay stepped back into the role of chief executive and told analysts on a conference call that he had never felt better about the company. The shares closed that day at around $40. Now, the next part is the part I find most human in the whole story, and it is worth telling gently. There was a vice president at Enron named Sharon Watkins. She had been reassigned to work for Andrew Fastow that summer, and part of her job was to look through a list of assets that were held in the various entities to work out which could be sold. And as she went through the list, she found that she could not make the numbers work. She found losses sitting inside the structures that had nowhere to go except back onto Enron. And in August, after Skilling resigned, she wrote a memo. It began with a sentence that has been quoted many times since. She wrote that she was incredibly nervous that the company would implode in a wave of accounting scandals. She sent it to Kenneth Lay, initially anonymously, and then met with him in person. And what happened next is, I think, the quietest and saddest thing in the story. Nothing much. The memo was passed to the company's law firm, which was the same firm that had helped construct the entities in the first place, and that firm looked into it and concluded that no further investigation was warranted. And the autumn arrived. On the 12th of October, lawyers at Arthur Andersen, the accounting firm that audited Enron's books, instructed staff in the Houston office to follow the firm's document retention policy, which in practice meant destroying documents. Over the following weeks, a very large quantity of paper was shredded, and a very large number of electronic files were deleted. On the 16th of October, Enron reported its results for the third quarter. It announced a loss of $618 million. And, almost as a footnote, it disclosed a reduction in shareholders' equity of $1.2 billion connected to the unwinding of the partnerships. That second number was the important one, and it took a few days for people to understand why. Because a loss in a quarter is a bad quarter. It happens, but a reduction in equity of that size, arriving without warning, and connected to entities that most investors had never heard of, meant that the accounts as previously published had not described the company accurately. On the 22nd of October, the Securities and Exchange Commission opened an inquiry. On the 23rd of October, Andrew Fastow was dismissed after it emerged how much he had personally earned from the partnerships he had designed. On the 8th of November, Enron filed a document with the regulator restating its financial results for the previous 4 years. This is the moment the company effectively ended, though it took another 3 weeks to become official. The restatement reduced previously reported profits by $586 million and added billions of dollars of debt onto the balance sheet that had not been shown there before. To restate accounts is to say, formally and in public, that the numbers you published before were wrong. And once a company has said that, the question every lender and every counterparty must ask is a simple one. If those numbers were wrong, how do we know these ones are right? On the 9th of November, a rival Houston energy company called Dynegy agreed to buy Enron. For about 3 weeks, it looked as though there might be a soft ending in which the company was absorbed and the pipelines carried on, and the story became a footnote. On the 28th of November, Dynegy withdrew. Its people had looked at the books, and they had found more than had been disclosed to them. And within hours, the credit rating agencies downgraded Enron's debt below investment grade. That downgrade is the actual mechanism of death, and it is worth explaining softly, because it is not obvious. Enron's business was trading, and to trade, you must be someone other people are willing to have a contract with. Its contracts contain clauses saying that if its credit rating fell below a certain level, large sums became immediately due. So the downgrade did not merely make borrowing harder, it converted future obligations into present ones all at once, and there was no money to meet them. The shares, which had been $90 18 months earlier, closed that day at around 60 cents. On the 2nd of December, 2001, Enron filed for bankruptcy protection. It was, at the time, the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history, with $63 billion in assets, and it held that record for less than a year. Let us slow down again because the numbers are the least important part of what follows. Around 20,000 people worked for Enron. Many of them held their retirement savings in Enron shares, partly because the company had encouraged it, and partly because for years it had seemed like the obvious thing to do. During the final months, the retirement plan was locked for a period while administrators were changed, and employees could not sell. And so a great many ordinary people who had done nothing wrong and who had understood none of the structures we have discussed tonight watched their savings become worth nothing while being unable to act. There were people who had worked there for 20 years. There were people in Houston whose entire street worked there. That is the part of this story that does not fit into a diagram, and it is the part worth remembering when the rest has faded. Now, the accounting firm. Arthur Andersen was one of the 5 great accounting firms in the world. It had been founded in 1913, it employed tens of thousands of people, and its reputation was its entire product. In June of 2002, a jury convicted it of obstruction of justice over the destruction of documents. In 2005, the Supreme Court of the United States reversed that conviction unanimously on the grounds that the jury had been given faulty instructions. But by then, it made no difference. The firm had already stopped auditing public companies. Its clients had gone, its partners had scattered to competitors. Around 28,000 people in the United States lost their jobs at a firm that was, in the end, legally cleared. And the 5 great accounting firms became 4, and they remain 4 to this day. As for the individuals, Andrew Fastow pleaded guilty, cooperated with the prosecution, and was sentenced to 6 years. Jeffrey Skilling was convicted on 19 counts and sentenced to 24 years, which was later reduced, and he was released in 2019. Kenneth Lay was convicted in May of 2006. He died of a heart attack that July before he could be sentenced, and because he died before his appeal could be heard, his conviction was legally vacated. Under American law, it is as though it had never been entered. Sharon Watkins, who wrote the memo, was named one of Time magazine's Persons of the Year, together with 2 other women who had spoken up inside other organizations. And in July of 2002, the American Congress passed a law called the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which changed how public companies are audited and required chief executives to personally certify their accounts, and created an independent board to oversee auditors. That law is still in force, and every listed company in America still lives inside it. And most people who comply with it every day have no particular reason to think about where it came from. So let us gather this up slowly and then let it go. If you take one thing from tonight, I would offer this. Almost nothing in this story was invented. Mark-to-market accounting was a real method approved by regulators with a genuine argument behind it. Special purpose entities were a real and ordinary tool, and still are. The gas bank was a genuinely good idea that solved a genuine problem for people who produced and consumed energy. Every individual piece was normal. What was not normal was the combination and the direction it all pointed in, and the fact that every single one of those tools happened to make the reported numbers better today at the cost of some other day. And nobody was standing in a position to see all of them at once. The auditors saw the accounting, the lawyers saw the structures, the board saw the summaries, the analysts saw the results, the employees saw their own desks, and each of them, looking at their own piece, saw something that was defensible. That is the shape of it, not a single enormous decision, but a very large number of small ones, each of which could be justified on its own, pointing quietly in the same direction for about a decade. And that shape is not unique to Enron, or to accounting, or to America. It is simply what happens when the reward for optimism arrives immediately and the cost of it arrives later. And nobody's job is to look at the whole thing. That is all. There is nothing left to resolve. The company is gone. The building was sold. The law was written. The people involved served their sentences or did not. And the pipelines, which were the boring part, the part nobody wanted to talk about, were bought by other companies, and they are still there, under the ground, moving gas from where it is to where it is wanted. They were the only part of it that was ever really solid. Thank you for listening. If you are still awake, let your breathing slow and let your jaw unclench, and let this drift away now because none of it needs anything from you. Sleep well.